Good afternoon. Hello, welcome. Okay, we are going to get started. Welcome to everyone here in Piggott Theater, and welcome to everyone who's joining us over Zoom. We are so thrilled to have you here. So one of my favorite alumni of all time, and I will acknowledge that I have a lot of favorite alumni of all time, but this one stands out. Harry Miles Muheim from the class of 41 used to say that if you met a Stanford alum on a street corner anywhere in the world, they would be able to tell you the story of Leland Jr. and the death that led to the founding of Stanford. We know the story for sure, but how many of us have really pondered what it means to be associated with a university that is only here because of the death of a child? This is the central question that the film we are about to see, Leland, A Stanford Story, tackles, and with it, the broader question of what education is for. I first heard about the film when the Historical Society sent out an invitation on the day that the first screening of the film was happening at MEMOD for the first-year students in college who were seeing it as part of, and that's college, all caps, Frosh College, Civic, Liberal, and Global Education, the new first-year core requirement. I couldn't attend, so I immediately wrote to Dan Edelstein, director of college, who was credited as the writer on the film, which I hadn't ever heard about. And I worked pretty closely with him. Dan sent me the link. Oh, you know what? The first question I got on Zoom was, who was the gentleman that opened the program? And I just did the same thing. So I'm Julia Hartung, and I'm on the program committee for the Historical Society, a member of the class of 82, and I work in the Office of Development. Sorry about that. Okay, so I wrote to Dan as the writer. Dan sent me the link, which I thought, oh, I'll watch a few minutes, and I proceeded to spend the next 39 minutes watching the whole thing because I found it so riveting. I knew I wanted to share it as widely as I could. That initially included 2 screenings at the Alumni Center where I work, and that's how I came to meet Dan's collaborator and the filmmaker, Henry Segal, class of 26. I am delighted today that we are not only able to get to watch the film, but we get to hear about how Dan and Henry came to make it and what they hope it sparks in our students. Dan Edelstein wears so many titles I couldn't possibly name them all, but he is the William Bonsall Professor of French and the Nihal and Jenny Raj Faculty Director of College. Henry Segal is a junior majoring in history, and his love of history started right here on campus when he received the sage advice to always read the plaques. And I would challenge any of you to have read as many plaques as Henry has. And hopefully we're gonna have a program on his 10 favorite plaques next year. Ask him about the secret story behind one in particular. He plans to attend law school after graduation. Finally, notably, he is also the only student member of the Stanford Historical Society Board and serves on the Membership and Development Committee. Dan and Henry will be in conversation with Steve Zipperstein, the Daniel E. Koshland Professor in Jewish Culture and History, and the former director for 16 years of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford. Steve was Henry's professor in his major research seminar this past quarter and is currently teaching a class called Biography as History. Our panel will come to the stage as soon as the film ends and discuss it. And when they open it up for Q&A, there will be microphones on either side, which will be important to use so that our Zoom guests can hear. And now we present Leland, A Stanford Story.
I want to start by offering the Stanford Historical Society an apology. And I've been waiting to do this for some 25 years. I could say shortly after I came to Stanford, but it actually wasn't shortly. It was 9 years later. I wrote a piece for Dissent magazine about the future of reading and books. And it was excerpted in the New York Times. And I came to campus full of myself and encountered my distinguished colleagues, David Kennedy and Carl Degler, who looked rather disapproving because of the following sentence in the piece. I write these words in a building on the Stanford campus carved out of limestone. Now, I come from a culture where apology is offered in the fall on a rather austere day, Yom Kippur. I know I'm speaking to a rather more genteel audience here, and I begin this program by offering my heartfelt apologies, albeit belatedly. Henry, you want to start talking about?
Sure. Yeah. So first, I want to thank everyone for coming. This is my first annual meeting, so it's definitely a special one, and this is also our second outside of the Alumni Center. This is our second viewing, a little bit of a different audience. Just going to give a little bit of context. The first showing was to a bunch of 18-year-olds who we were trying to kind of give advice on how to think about college. And this is a little bit different audience, a few months older. But I still think I kind of had a totally different watching of it today than I have before. I don't know if Professor Edelstein wants to give any words.
Well, I just want to thank Henry for all the amazing creativity he put into this, because this is actually the 2.0 version. There was a 1.0 version that we had screened the previous year. And I'd worked on that version with Stanford Video, who did a great job, with all the footage, and they did all of the interviews. But it had nothing of the soul and nothing of the blending of all the wonderful archival footage that Henry found, and the interviews with the students were also all Henry's doing. And so it's kind of amazing to write something. I'm not a cinematographer in any way, but to write something and sort of work with Stanford Video, who did exactly what I asked them to, but I needed somebody who actually had a vision to do that, and then to see sort of what it became in Henry's hands is really moving. And it's, I think it really captured the fundamental goal of this story, which, as Henry said, is, frosh, come to campus. I've often felt a certain degree of, to say an annoyance is a bit too strong, but there's a sort of perpetual youth aspect to going to college, where it's like you're going to be 18 forever. And so starting greeting them with the sentence that none of us would be here were it not for the death of a child was also kind of a way of grabbing them, by the collar and say, hey, education is a serious business, and there's a degree of gravity that needs to be taken on for education. And I think what I love about Henry's version of the script and all of the additions he made is that it really, I think, really conveys that gravity, conveys the seriousness and the sadness that went into the founding of this university, and that I also think should preside to some degree over education.
What if we begin with this? The emphasis on usefulness from the very outset of this university. I think we're living in a moment when there's greater scrutiny of one sort or another on universities like ours than at any point in recent memory. sometimes albeit bizarre scrutiny. Could you talk about the way in which the original preoccupation with usefulness has, to one extent or another, shaped this university in ways that are different from our peer institutions, Yale, Harvard, elsewhere?
The one thing I would kind of say on that is it's actually in the language of the founding grant. It says personal usefulness. And I don't know if the other inferior institutions on the East Coast would say personal. I think they would just say usefulness.
So we're beginning to generally denigrate those institutions now, but
no. I think it's personal usefulness, and I think if you just kind of follow the way Leland Jr. was raised or kind of lived his childhood, I think his parents were very okay with being personally useful, whatever that meant to you, whether that was collecting and opening a museum. It didn't mean you had to be, farming the most efficient way, which was what Leland Sr. would have been doing at that age.
Dan, we're both in the humanities. I've been here for a long time. I've just identified one of my early errors. And what I've sensed about Stanford, and I've really enjoyed about Stanford, and tell me whether this makes any sense to you, is that here, say in contrast to Yale, one is reminded, I think usefully, of the way in which, irrespective of how many languages one knows, how much one has read, how much one has published in the humanities, that all of knowledge isn't contained in the humanities, that actually physics counts. And one is reminded of that in ways at Stanford that distinguish Stanford from other institutions that are considered to be our peer institutions. Does that make sense?
I think so, very much. One thing I appreciate as being a humanist at Stanford is that there's a kind of underdog mentality, and I felt more connected to my colleagues in other departments. I went to grad school at Penn, and I didn't really know anybody in other departments, and I didn't get the sense that my professors hung out much with people in other departments either, whereas we certainly have a sense of, we got to band together, but it does, I think, lead to more, not only to more connections among us and even in our scholarship, but also I quite like teaching the humanities to non-humanities majors. I'm pretty happy that there's going to be engineers out there who occasionally think about French literature, Roman history, Greek philosophy, and I think that's actually, to me, much truer to the spirit of an undergraduate education. And I think actually what's happened with many of our East Coast peers is that they've actually abandoned to some degree the original mission of a college education in favor of the German research model, which emphasizes specialization, which emphasizes research productions which are not in any sense meant to be practical, but are just advancing research. And I think that's something we haven't wrestled with enough, even at Stanford, that we're really being pulled in different directions between sort of the graduate mission, the research mission of the university, and the teaching undergraduate mission of the university, in which, as I said, we should aim that every graduate, the physicists, the engineers, the finance graduates, that they have this mind that's worth spending the rest of their lives in, right? It's not something that you only do if you decide to do a PhD in the humanities.
And the imprint of California. You're not from California. You're from Texas. Right. I learned that in our seminar together. What imprint does California leave? Because we're the only institution of this kind in the far West, and there's something that distinguishes us. That, how would you capture that? I've tried to sort of figure that out over the 30 more years that I've been here, and I wonder if you could relieve me of this question?
I can try. Well, I mean, one thing is that the history of California, at least I'll call it in the Bay Area, is one and the same of Stanford. I mean, Leland Sr. himself was senator, governor, if not one of the most just influential people in the Bay Area, period. And I think every step of the way, whether anything that has to do with the history of the Bay Area is also the history of the Stanford. That's the earthquake, that's Silicon Valley. I mean, it's both a self-fulfilling cycle. And I don't know, it may also, to kind of be the larger idea, which is just the fact that the West is inherently more focused on kind of exploring and trying new things just because it's newer, and that almost in the way that like kind of people think of manifest destiny when they think of the American West. There wasn't kind of structures to go on top of. You were kind of forced to start yourself.
And was that part of what drew you here, or do you see that manifest in the way in which the university runs, what we wrestle with? You know, when you speak with your friends who went elsewhere, to lesser institutions on the East Coast, you know, we're just invited these days to just lambaste them. And when you speak to them, does this come out in your conversations and comparing your fate to theirs?
To be
you don't get out very often?
Yeah. No, I'm going to go to the first thing you asked,
Okay.
Which is that what drew me? And the answer is no. And what drew me here was, how could you say no to Stanford? But that's just because Stanford is Stanford. I think I really kind of appreciated the character, or the soul, whatever that is, by year two. And the question is, what are we wrestling with? I think there was a line in a book that Professor Edelstein, I'm going to say gave me, but he lent it to me. I still have it. By Clark Kerr, who was the president of the UC system for a while. And he described the university of a series of faculty entrepreneurs whose only common thread is a shared grievance over parking. And I think that is what we're wrestling with, where the only thing that, you know, I think the only thing that the medical school and a history undergrad student and a law professor, the only thing I think they should be sharing more than just the same email address.
Yeah, well, he had a pretty tough time at Berkeley, as I recall, Clark Kerr. Dan, just one last question, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Is there a special kind of, to what extent does the present moment make you think about university education differently than you might have before the present moment became present? Do you want to, is that sentence at all coherent?
Well, I think that, you know, there's different ways of glossing the present moment, right? There's a way in which we're in an incredibly uncertain moment because the post-war agreement between governments and research universities might possibly be ending. Hopefully not, because that would be catastrophic, I think, for the country, and it would also devastate universities. But there's also other ways to gloss the present moment. One of them, for instance, is with the rise of generative AI, which I think worries a lot of us because it's so prevalent, it's so sort of easy to use, and really cuts to the heart or risks cutting off the arteries feeding the heart of liberal education. Now, I think that we have a great opportunity, actually, which is to renew the more traditional vision of liberal education, perhaps stepping back a little bit away from the immediate application of knowledge, which we don't know how that's going to play out in 5-10 years. You can't look an undergraduate in the eyes and say, okay, well, if you really want to make sure that you're financially well off in 10 years, major in X. We don't know, actually, what X will be. But what we do know is that there are these fundamental skills, very transferable skills, like knowing how to communicate clearly, knowing how to think critically, knowing how to engage in conversation with others. Those are not going to be easily taken away by AI. They're not easy to replicate. And it turns out that those are both really valuable skills to have in life and with friends and family, and they're incredibly valuable skills in the professional world. And employers tell us this repeatedly. But where do you get those skills? Well, it turns out that it's not in a big lecture hall listening to a professor talk about pretty much anything, whether it's humanities or STEM. It's in the small humanities seminars where you're reading, you're talking about the reading, you're exchanging views, you're maybe doing oral exams, which we're going to be probably bringing back to a greater degree, blue book writing, because that's the only way to know that students aren't using ChatGPT or some other service. But that's also really the heart of a liberal education. So I'm hopeful that one of the big threats, not the first one I mentioned, but this other one, which is not going away in 3 years, right? This one is going to be around for a lot longer. Maybe it'll actually have a salutary effect in bringing back the kind of vision of liberal education that I think was also there at the founding of the university.
I haven't heard the term salutary effect used recently with regard to universities, so thank you for that. Let me just say this. I met Henry in the kind of seminar that you're describing. I've often taught the seminar for history majors, and I don't assign any topic. And with the presumption that one could actually think usefully about any aspect of history across the board. And Henry came to write about land usage in Texas, a topic that I know as much about as I know about physics. And he soared in the seminar, and that's how we met and became friends. And I found probably among all the great pleasures of being at Stanford, of writing my books at Stanford, of working with my colleagues, the greatest pleasure of all is the encounter that I've had with students like Henry, domestic-born and international, who are just extraordinary. And I've never regretted coming here and joining their intellectual community. And I want to commend you, Henry.
Thank you very much.
And now questions, please.
So I think we'll start with Zoom while people are getting to the microphones. We have 2 comments and 1 question. The first felt that this was an unfair characterization of Mrs. Stanford about the number of women, limiting the number of women. There was no such intent at the outset, but she and the university were being ridiculed as becoming a women's school, similar to Radcliffe and Barnard on the East Coast. That is what led to the limitation. So you might comment on that if you'd like. Let me read the next one. Did the producers have an understanding how profound it was to have Asian students, both Chinese and Japanese, at the outset, when the California Constitution prohibited their owning property, etc., starting in 1879, and that was not repealed until 1952. Also, the first alumni club formed outside California reportedly was our alumni in Tokyo. So that's an FYI. And then the question is, besides somebody asking if they could watch the film again after, so we might want to send the link. I am glad there was a focus on diversity and equity regarding women, African Americans, Native Americans, and Hispanic communities, but I am appalled at the complete lack of mention of the LGBTQ community. Stanford's Gay People's Union was founded in 1971, the first such organization in a U.S. college, and probably in the world, and Stanford Pride today has over 4,000 members. Several LGBTQ Stanford alumni are famous: Peter Thiel, Sally Ride, Sam Altman, Jason Collins. Why were we not mentioned? Biases much?
I'll take it. One thing, this actually also came up in Professor Zipperstein's office.
But I didn't say I was appalled.
No.
The film also ignored the paucity of Zippersteins in the history of Stanford.
And Segals.
Yeah.
I think you can kind of think of the film as like the opening of 8 different conversations. We can only fit, when we're trying to kind of tell the history of the school, we kind of have like 8 kind of buckets, and I think each of them really could be their own film. And it's, I don't know if Professor Edelstein has a different answer, but I think like we can kind of think of this film as where to branch off, and each kind of section, each 5-minute section, I think could be its own 40-minute film. But inevitably, I think we're going to leave out a dozen or more groups, however you define them, when we try and do kind of 8 themes in one 40-minute section. But it was not a deliberate like exclusion.
Yeah, and actually we had to cut a lot left and right, and I think the goal in in talking about the way in which different student communities face challenges at Stanford, I don't think we went about it in the sense of okay, here's a list of groups that we have to make sure we check each one. It's more like we just want to show that this is it's an evolving story, and really I think the thing we tried to highlight most was like this is a story that's driven by students themselves. This is a film that's made primarily for Frosh, right? It's not supposed to. That's the target audience, right? And so we're really just trying to to show that there's a wide variety of ways of being at Stanford, but we're not going to be able to list all of them.
First of all, thank you, Dan and Henry, for making this film. It's wonderful. I love that you see Stanford through the lens of Leland, because I think it's hard not to go. It's hard to go here and not vibe with Leland, because his life is just opening up, and so is the Stanford students. But I want to ask you both: what if he had not died? What do you think would his life have been like? And we know that he probably would have founded a museum, but how would have history changed? I don't see him running the Southern Pacific Railroad. What if he'd lived?
Want to try that? I think housing would probably be more affordable here. There'd be much more space to build apartments. But outside of this zip code, I don't think Silicon Valley exists without a university right here, and specifically a university that was doing what it was doing. Now, Professor Edelstein and I discussed this a little bit, but there's a question of, was every kind of ultra-rich kid like this, or at least described like this? Having tutors, and they learned the Rosetta Stone and have their own fossil collection. And I don't think that's the case. And I've read his letters are all in the archives. And he did really seem like a kid who's kind of switched on at, you can kind of tell by age 11, there's a lot of typed up letters when he wrote on his first time to Europe. And I don't know what he would have done. Not run the railroad, but I think the more important thing is I don't think California would be the same at all. I don't think California would be even close to how we think of California now.
Yeah, I think Henry gave a great answer. I don't really have anything else I can add to that.
There was another question up here. Yeah.
Thank you all. And could you tell us a little bit more about the production of the film? When did the idea come about to do this? Where did you get funding? Was all the post-production technical capability available here on campus and so forth? And were there any technical or other challenges that you encountered anywhere along the way where maybe you thought, we just can't do this, and somehow you overcame it?
I just want to add, I wonder, did you have, while you're making this, any sort of Steven Spielberg moment where you thought, you know, law school was what I thought about when I was a child. I'm gonna do this.
Well, to answer the first part of the question, Muybridge started the film, and that was the first shot. So this is really a Professor Edelstein question, but
Did you have your Steven Spielberg moment?
yeah.
No, I did not. But
It's too late for him.
well, my Steven Spielberg moment was actually when I saw one of Henry's other films that he'd made for a class. And I knew Henry through the Summer Humanities Institute. And I'd already done the first version of the film. And I said, I need you. But, it's interesting. This actually came about, a number of things obviously went into it. Like, one is that I just fundamentally believe that students at Stanford should know something about the history of the institution. That's that Cicero quote, to be ignorant of your past is to always remain a child. And I also, had become kind of struck by Leland Jr. It was that melancholy museum at the Cantor, which I think we should rename the Leland Stanford Jr. Museum. That's the one thing he really wanted. So maybe, but we were trying to bring back actually this first lecture that used to exist during new student orientation, where a faculty member would talk about liberal education, and I had asked a few people to do this. We'd had one person agree. Students showed up, they were doing chemistry homework, didn't go very well, and I was thinking, how am I going to every year find somebody to do this? Like, when there's not that many people, you can only ask Alex Nemiroff to give so many lectures, and it's like a really hard gig. And I was down with Parna Sengupta, who my partner in crime in SIS, who Ellen Woods knows well, and I think hired, and we were talking about this one day. Actually, we were in LA. She thinks it was because we were in LA that this was I had this idea. I said, well, what if instead of having a lecture, we did a film? And that way we don't have to find somebody else every year. It was a very practical solution. And I just started writing it. I remember one night, it was like in December, and it was raining. And I looked at my wife and said, I have to go down and film. And I don't film. Like, I have an iPhone. I've never made a movie. That's not my genre. But I just knew I wanted to film, actually, the rain in the old quad and the memorial. And that was the first opening of the movie. That Henry found a much better one. But, this is Stanford. Like, to your earlier point, Steve, about like what makes Stanford distinctive compared to some East Coast schools. The joke is that the unofficial mantra of Cambridge, and I think this probably applies to our East Coast peers as well, is nothing can ever be done for the first time. Right? Just nothing. And I really feel like Stanford is the exact opposite. Like, you have an idea and someone says, that's great, here's a check. And so, no, there were no production difficulties. It was just, hey, does anyone want to do this? Like, sure, let's do it. Call up Stanford Video. They'll set up everything. The artistic vision, and that was what I really felt was lacking in the first version.
There's another question.
I'm very interested in documentary films, and I wonder how you decided to create at the beginning with this woman playing the organ, which to me is very existential. That is, you're emphasizing life and death and to be aware of your life. How did you decide on that? And this may seem a little strange. I would like to have each one of you say who you are, because
We assume you know.
I know. I know, because I'm at Stanford, you would think I would know, but I don't.
No.
So could you say something about yourself? But I am interested in how you decided to be the beginning and end, and how did you find this woman to do this part?
Yeah, I think that's probably my favorite part. And first of all, I'm Henry, for those of you who don't know me, from Houston. I've always kind of loved movies, and then decided one day just to make one. And I started doing this on my iPhone when I was 15 or 16. And most of the stuff I've made has been kind of short documentaries. So this was really fun to kind of try and do something longer, but also where I kind of got to live in. I almost felt like a geologist. Like I was living in the subject matter for 2 years before I was even approached about this. As for Ihe, the woman on the organ, a friend came to me and just kind of randomly told me, he goes, there's a girl in my power class, which is the freshman, sophomore writing requirement. He goes, that plays the organ in Memchu. And I said, there's no way, you need to send me her number right now. I think this might be interesting for the movie, and worst case scenario is I get to go see the organ. And I didn't, the metaphor of the organist not being able to hear it, and Leland Jr. never really being able to see the school, that kind of just happened. It was not something I was actively thinking about, but the second she said that, I kind of pressed her on it, oh, well, what do you mean by that? And, have you ever thought about that, this one's dedicated to the dad, and the arch that used to be over there is to the son. And I was really kind of trying to shoot for moments that I just had a lot of gravity, even if they weren't, obviously recognizable. So obviously the mausoleum scene, which was before I was on the project, is very powerful. Where they open the doors, that's probably the hardest thing that was done.
That was the hardest production part, finding who controls the doors to the mausoleum.
But another one like that, which wasn't in for more than 30 seconds, was the Boneyard, which is something I found out from my first Historical Society event about the sandstone, not the limestone. And the second I heard of that, I thought, oh my gosh, this is one of the most moving things ever, and it just felt like an architectural cemetery. For context, this is where the last of the original sandstone from it's the Greystone Quarry, right? From the Greystone Quarry outside of San Jose is kept. So there's really none of the original stone left. It's just kind of the pieces that fell in the earthquake, and it felt like seeing an endangered species. So I really love that part and kind of wish it was in more. But I was going for parts that were kind of heavy historically or metaphorically, and just fun to visit. Part of it was the whole thing was such a pleasure for me to be a part of. This is just what I'm very interested in, and I feel like the documentary is almost an excuse to get to see these things.
Why don't you introduce yourself? I'll introduce myself and close the program.
Well, let me just share my favorite moment doing the film is when we did get the keys to the mausoleum. So if you've ever been inside the mausoleum, you may already know that when you walk in, you have to say, "Hi, Jane." Otherwise, you and your descendants will be cursed for 5 generations. But then we wanted to get this shot of the doors opening. And the way we had to do that is that the sound guy and I went inside the mausoleum and shut the doors. And then we sort of gave ourselves like a little nod, and then we opened them together. But there was that moment when we were inside the mausoleum, and it was all dark. And it was very moving. I had a little moment with Jane. But I guess maybe the way I'll say who I am is that, so my name is Dan Edelstein. I came to Stanford as an assistant professor of French, and I used to commute down from the city and walk down Palm Drive, walk through Memorial Court, and every day I would see a plaque that was for Robert Edouard Pellissier, an assistant professor of French who died in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And that was actually the first piece I wrote about Stanford history in the Hedgehog Review. It's called "In the Ruins of Western Civilization."
We have a question from the back row. This back row over here. Beyond that, thank you so much for all of your efforts. What do you suppose might have been or was the pillow talk between Governor Stanford and his wife? Having the money to fund something is one thing, and having the idea to do something that they did is another. How do you think that all worked out?
We try to avoid pillow talk. Do you want to transform this from PG to something?
Well, the story is that as Leland Jr. lay dying in Florence, tended to by Catholic nuns, which is actually why, slight digression, the Leland Stanford Mansion in Sacramento, which I got to visit with my daughter Eloise, who's in the audience, and who kindly accepted to go on a 2-hour guided tour of the Leland Stanford Mansion for me. But for many years, it was actually an orphanage, for a Catholic orphanage, and that was actually to thank the nuns who had tended Leland in Florence. But the story is that he's dying, Leland Sr. is at the foot of the bed, and completely breaking down, and at one point falls asleep and has a dream. And in the dream, his son, who he knows is about to die, sort of says, do it for humanity, or live for humanity. And that's when Leland Sr. interprets it as saying, I have to build a university. That's the probably apocryphal version, but apparently it was a kind of very quickly they knew they had to do some sort of meaningful memorial for their son.
I want to end perhaps a counterintuitively contentious note. I was just reflecting on the use of the term appalling in that first question that was asked. And being the longstanding director of Jewish studies, who's not felt beleaguered here at the university, despite the president's assistance, I've thought about what it is as university citizens we've failed to do over the last many years. And I think one of the features of intellectual life that we fail to challenge is the notion that if we're not mentioned in a production like this, it's appalling. And I think we have to get beyond appalling in order to create open conversation, serious conversation without limits. And so, I thought about the absence of mention of Jews when Henry first showed me the film, and I understand the response of the questioner and sympathize with the questioner in as much as LGBTQ issues weren't aired. But we're not going to be able to air everything, and we're going to have different emphases in our intellectual lives. And it's really, really important for us to actually shoulder that as we move forward in what is likely to be a increasingly contentious, difficult, and hopefully also wonderful intellectual experience. It seems to me that to the extent to which this evening could be described, to use the term that was used before, the great pleasure of finding Henry. Let us all salute Henry. Thank you.
Thank you. You'll see on the screen here, what we have is, this is our last meeting of this year. And next year is the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Stanford Historical Society. So we have a year devoted to that, and we've had a task force working on that. And our first two events will be very interesting. In fact, I would like Steve Zipperstein. Steve, I'd like you to come to our first event because David Kennedy is going to speak on Stanford history. Yes. Yes. But so our first event is going to be a members-only event. Now, anyone can still join, but it's a members-only event, so we all have a room. It's at Sonny Scott's home. That's Sonny Scott's home, which is a very wonderful historic house here at Stanford. And we had an event there when we celebrated the publication of the biography of Wallace Stirling last year, and that was a wonderful event. So this will be a spectacular event, and David Kennedy will be speaking on Stanford history. That's in October. And then in November, we're going to have a lecture by Paul Turner, who 50 years ago wrote the book, Founders and the Architects, about the founding of the university and the architecture. Paul is going to give a lecture, and it'll be an illustrated lecture, so I think it'll be quite fascinating with all the slides. And he did a terrific job of this book, and as an assistant professor, he then later became a full professor of architecture and art. So Paul is going to talk to us about that, and the Society is now looking into the possibility of reprinting his book, which is out of print, and if it is, we will give it a free copy to all members. So thank you, by the way, our panel. You did an absolutely wonderful job. Great program. We now have a reception outside with some wonderful food, and thank you all.